My relationship with Lazaris has a couple of distinct stages. The first stage was opening and exploration. And this was 12, 13, 14 years old. And, moving from not having any idea that channeling was possible or what it was to grasping that it existed, to an initial evaluation of the material as being interesting, novel, humorous, informative, exciting, didn't seem particularly harmful, and curious. And as I moved into a depression, my first kind of suicidal period kind of correlating with childhood trauma and abuse, kind of hit the fan a little bit at 13, and I noticed that Lazaris was a comforting presence. And unfortunately, in an emotionally illiterate culture with, a complete void of psychological intelligence in school, there was no alternative to me that I was aware of to know what this was, to talk about it. So I just noticed that I was in a world where I was incredibly dissociated, is what I would say today. But of course, I didn't have language for that at the time. But I noticed that Lazaris connected in that place. So this added an emotional validity to mental interest. And so from that point, I began buying all the tapes in my teen, babysitting, saving up money, buying Lazaris tapes. And I remember conquering fear was one of them, because as someone traumatized, that fear of death, that fear of abandonment, betrayal, etc., is always present in my body. And I, of course, wanted to see if Lazaris could help with that. And right from the get-go, Lazaris talked about payoffs and negative ego and self-pity and martyrhood as, all being the reasons how I was creating my whole reality, 100%, no ifs, ands, or buts. And the reason, I was feeling bad or having horrible things happen was because I had payoffs, if I got to feel sorry for myself or this, that, and the other. And I wasn't able to do much with the material at that point. But Lazaris had endless reasons why this was happening, namely that my negative ego was always lying to me, that my martyr was getting in the way, this, that, and the other. And, what did I know? Could be true. So I began journaling and noticing and trying to, monitor my feelings and writing a diary of emotions and this, that, the other. And didn't experience any pivot or shift except for the healing the inner child, healing the inner adolescent. So while I was 14, 15, 16 years old, I was doing meditations on healing the inner child, healing the inner adolescent. And I did sense a shift there. And so that was working. But my parents were still getting divorced. I was still being and feeling traumatized. My siblings were still getting abused, and none of that changed. And things like the 33-second technique and stuff felt shitty, meaning it was painful to have Lazaris say that these techniques worked and this and that if they didn't work, I didn't really want them. And nothing was shifting. And the idea that this was all my fault felt more painful than not even going there. And so I just decided to study more and more of, Lazaris's mental landscape. Just listen to tapes and do a meditation. But, and so I went through thousands of hours of tapes and meditations. And the supposition that, I was allowing in that period was that, Lazaris was what he said and his techniques worked. And the reason they didn't work for me was there was something wrong with me. And presumably that would get fixed somehow, that whatever was wrong with me would not be wrong with me if I just kept learning and learning more. And so that continued until my first relationship with a Lazaris partner, or another Lazaris friend who had been working with Lazaris for 20, 30 years, something like that. And then we applied the Lazaris tapes. We'd listen to the Lazaris tapes together and try and improve our relationship, which was rather rocky. And they did not help at all. In fact, in many cases, they seemed to lead to blame or making things worse. What did work was my own strategy. For example, she was a bit of a bully. And what I learned was that because I'm conflict averse and sensitive, meaning if we get into a conflict, it affects me. She likes fighting. Really affects me, though. I don't enjoy fighting, and so I'm susceptible to bullying to avoid the intensity of conflict. And so I learned that basically I had to figure out anything that was important to me before I got into an interaction with her, and had to make a list of agreements, often in writing, like, okay, so we're going to go on an outing together, but if I want to go home because I'm not enjoying the outing or whatever, we have to agree that we're going home then. You're not just going to bully me because, we're out there and you've decided we're going to do this and this. That I'm not going to enter interactions without a framework of agreements, because she would keep the agreements if she'd made them beforehand, but would bully me and manipulate me if we were out and I'd lost my leverage, so to speak, to say, yeah, I'm not going to go on that event if it's going to go down like this. And so that worked really well. And so there were, what was working in the relationship was stuff that I was coming up with along those lines, but it still didn't resolve very well. And then we went and did coaching with several other Lazaris friends. And that didn't help much at all. In one case, there was this woman called Trebi, who I paid $400 to listen to all the reasons she hated men. That obviously didn't help. And so that wasn't going very well. And eventually, my partner's rage attacks, were just too much, too re-traumatizing, and I decided to leave the relationship. Now, then I went to some courses at the Human Awareness Institute, and in the first weekend, I learned more about communication techniques and all of that than I had in the entirety of my 5,000 hours of listening to Lazaris. And it was fun. So it was successful and it was fun. And this really threw me, because Lazaris has been, was talking about being the highest resonance to ever touch humanity and this and that. And it's like, why can't the highest resonance who's ever touched humanity do as good job as some basic human beings who aren't claiming anything? Lazaris workshops aren't particularly fun compared to all this interaction and group dynamics and buddy sharing and stuff. I'm learning better in the Human Awareness Institute format, which is small groups, buddies, large group shares, and they're listening. I have a space to speak. I don't have a space to speak with Lazaris, because Lazaris designs their events as monologues. I can count on 5 fingers the number of minutes that I've actually spoken to Lazaris. Lazaris has spoken to me for 5,000 hours. I've spoken to Lazaris for 5 minutes. Lazaris doesn't like listening for whatever reason, and I integrate and learn through speaking, so that's a big format gap. And it boiled down to I'm having more fun at the Human Awareness Institute. I'm succeeding more at the Human Awareness Institute. And my partners at the Human Awareness Institute are not bullying me. And the coaching isn't all about hating men. And so this is great. The only puzzle is, why the hell did I spend all that time trying to learn about great relationships from Lazaris when it just takes a few weekends that are a lot more fun to learn here? And I had no answer to that. But I thought that by Lazaris's own definition, which was kind of my formative template or platform for developing a lot of ideas in adolescence, that if life is about being consciously creating success and consciously creating fun, if I'm doing that 5 times, 4 times, 5 times more with these human beings than I am with Lazaris, then by Lazaris's own definition, I should be over here and not at Lazaris. It just seemed puzzling that Lazaris's guidelines would lead me away from Lazaris, but they did. And things were working very well. There was a big growth curve around that time, particularly in the first 6 or so high workshops. But then things began to plateau there. And basically I thought I'd love to ask Lazaris about all this. I'd love to discuss it with Lazaris friends, but Lazaris friends don't want to hear anything negative about Lazaris. And so it just seemed easier to just let Lazaris go and focus on what was actually working. So I did that. But I didn't entirely. I mean, certainly I have a good memory, and I'd spent 5,000 hours exploring Lazaris and various things. And so, that is there. And but that took me away from Lazaris for, a good eight years or so. Then one of the Human Awareness Institute facilitators, Peter Sandhill, sexually abused me under the influence of psychedelics, meaning the waves of suicide kept coming back from time to time. And how I define that is I notice, one, that I'm in more pain than well-being. And so I'd had a suicidal wave during, all the screaming in my household at age 14. And, listening to Lazaris meditations, taking the headphones off, trauma and screaming, listening to Lazaris, taking the headphones off, certainly not seeing any impact on my outer reality from doing anything with rooms of beliefs and all that. And that's one of the reasons, it felt dangerous to get into a self-shame blame loop that Lazaris is saying, I'm creating all this. It's the last thing that I want to be experiencing. It's going on out there. I have no legal authority. I have no money. I have, I'm stuck in this house that is hellish. And I want to get out of this pain. And so I looked at running away from home, and I'm pretty rational, so I've studied survival books, and I kept evaluating as you're out in the cold in the wilderness. I'm a vegetarian. I'd have to start hunting because my father had let our passports expire in Canada, and I had nowhere else to go. And so, if the way our legal system works, if I interacted with, the outer world, I would be returned to my parents or put in a foster home. And when you're highly traumatized, I found that my best results were having a lot of control over my own environment. Having a strict routine, for example, really helped. Again, nothing from Lazaris. That was from an anthroposophical doctor. So again, what's really working, I went downhill kind of during my time with Lazaris, but the strict routine took me out, in a positive direction. The anthroposophists, exposed to through Waldorf schools, which is another story. My kindergarten teacher in Waldorf school traumatized me, physically and psychologically. One of my other Waldorf teachers physically abused me, slamming the desk down on my hands at one point as punishment, and then there was humiliation. And so there's one of the themes that I've noticed in my life is the unacknowledged shadow and rage towards revealing shadow in all of these alternative and new age things. My parents were hippies. I learned about Lazaris from my father. So there's lip service to a lot of these things, whether it's in school or otherwise. And tremendous betrayal and abuse, concurrent with that. And I weighed, how I would feel like I've never lied to people. And so, if you're running away, it's an uncomfortable situation to have to evade things. So I stuck it out at home until I could leave at 17. But this noticing that I'm in more pain than well-being, a lot more pain than well-being, and noticing that I've done everything that I know how to do, thousands of hours with Lazaris, doing this, journaling, achieving thousands of goals, learning to make money, starting a company, being debt-free, and the pain just keeps coming. It's like, And when I finally created a lot of free time for myself through successfully operating a business such that I didn't have to work that much, the pain seeped in to that space, meaning that space to do all the things that I wanted to do. The adrenaline rush of getting through and survival, when it calmed down, left me in pain. It's like the backwater of pain caught up with my boat. And there was no outer crisis to distract from it. And I had no way of dealing with it. I mean, I'd done the shame tapes, I'd done the pain tapes, I'd done this and that and the other. And so, it's like no amount of money is going to stop this pain. No amount of Lazaris tapes are going to stop this pain. No diet is going to stop this pain. I've eaten organic and vegetarian. I've been to Findhorn. I've traveled in different places of the world. I already had, cool parents with, interests in metaphysics. I went to Waldorf school. I can't, because when you're in the consensus reality, you can say, oh, well, maybe if I discovered Lazaris in my teenage years, think of how different my life would be. Or, if I had parents that liked organic food, the diet in America, it's ruining these children. And, but I'd done most of these things more than most of the people I'd ever met. Vegetarian, organic, this, that, and the other. Looking at books, reading, Seth material in my teens, writing poetry, achieving goals. None of it touched this pain. And it didn't help that Lazaris was saying essentially that it was my fault. Because if I didn't have a negative ego, blah, 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 then it would all magically be this wonderful new age. And for most, as I said, in the early period, I thought, well, who knows? Maybe other people working with the Lazaris material are having this great result. It's just me, and wonder what their world is like. Well, there was a certain hope in there that one day I would, figure that out. But when I discovered that Lazaris didn't know how to teach great relationship practices in either the format or the content, even as good as human beings. And then psychologists, and I started doing a lot of therapy. And then some of the therapists said, that was shaming for Lazaris to say to a teenage boy being abused, you were, this. And it's like, yeah, it's not what I would tell a teenager who's being abused. Why are you creating your reality? And yeah, I understand what they're saying. And so you can't tell Lazaris any of this either. Lazaris isn't interested in listening. He doesn't send out survey forms, concept synergy. It's very clear. And if you learn at the Lazaris events from old timers, it doesn't really help to bring any of this stuff up to concept synergy. And so you don't. It's shaming to bring something important to you up and then have it brushed aside, as has happened a lot. And so that doesn't feel good. And the high thing plateaued. There was a fair amount of abuse in, all of these lover relationships that I explored. And I just thought, no amount of sex, no amount of money, no amount of free time, no amount of goal accomplishment, no amount of Lazaris meditations, no amount of Seth books, no amount of... I'd done 6 hours of therapy for several years. What I noticed a couple of things. One, I noticed that the first few sessions with a healer or therapist tended to be the most potent. That's one thing. So I switched it around a lot, worked with 40 different practitioners, and anyone I'd find that had a good rep, I would try them out and try and get at least that initial burn from those few sessions. Then I learned that they all say different things. It's quite hilarious. You can go to energy person number A on Monday, and they'll say it's all about this. Then you go to energy person number B on Wednesday, and they say it's all about something else. And then you go to energy person C or therapist number C on Friday, and they say it's different stuff. And I got to know who was good at what, and I got to try and see, do any of them agree with anything? I mean, you say it's the governing and central meridian. You say you have to clear this and the aura. You say this. And I got really impatient with stuff that I couldn't feel, so I tuned all those out. I don't really care what your story is. I care, do I feel better after spending 2 hours with you? If I do, we'll do some more. If not, I don't give a shit if it's astrology this or Reiki this or acupuncture this. I'm here to feel better. My quest is, can I pivot this ratio so that I'm enjoying my felt experience of the moment more than I'm in pain? Because I've been terrified. 60% of my life energy is managing terror. It's what I would now call PTSD, but of course Lazaris and nobody else bothered to mention that either. So I learned about PTSD years later after $140,000 of therapies and stuff, and I learned about it from a stranger in a cafe. Hooray for strangers in cafes, boo for therapists not knowing anything or educating their clients about PTSD. And complex PTSD, when you've been shocked and traumatized at a young age, your body never resets. So it's just always, in some of that fight flight thing, and every little thing feels like a threat. Well, I've lived my life that way and no amount of money, goals and stuff shifts that pattern. And so it's just exhausting to be, in that high level of anxiety. I feel it right now. I've lived another day of that, high level anxiety, the grief, of needing to relate to life as a threat because my body is always sending off alarms. And of course the idea of a healing or blending with Lazaris where that would all melt away wonderfully, easily, miraculously, whatever, and that's never happened. And it hasn't happened for anyone that I know also. That was the other thing. And so that was painful because it's, what I want more than anything else is that is a reset in my biology. And so I was in another suicidal wave. I'm exhausted. I don't have the energy to listen to another therapist's bullshit about how it's all going to clear up in a few days and they're wonderful and their techniques always work and blah, blah, blah. I don't have the energy. I've got the money. I don't have the energy to go through another wave of disappointment, of pain. And I thought, this is generally my conversation around suicide. I thought, let's review everything because it's pretty final to commit suicide. And I've certainly heard all the stories from Lazaris and other people, you came here for a purpose, your soul has a purpose. I asked one channel, what would happen if I killed myself? And they said, well, your soul would probably send another part of you back, because there's some purpose to this lifetime. And I thought, well, that'd be kind of a waste of time to get to this stage of maturity and then, have to do it all over again. So it's like, what am I missing? What haven't I done? I've done all these things that I've known, and most of them haven't worked. And the ones that have worked, I've maxed them out and to a point where there's a diminishing return. And then I'm in pain again. And so I thought, well, I've never been drunk, never taken a recreational drug, never smoked marijuana, nothing like that. And so I thought, well, I wonder if there's anything about that. I've never liked drugs. People who have trauma is a very out of control experience. So the last thing you want is to be out of control. It's not usually something that a traumatized person seeks out. And I certainly saw no appeal to, losing it or altered states like that. I wanted to be in control, which is one of the reasons I liked all Lazaris's, ideas and stuff. It's very meticulous. But it wasn't working. And so I read the studies, on MDMA and psilocybin for PTSD and trauma. And even though I didn't know that I had PTSD and trauma at the time, because Stranger in Cafe hadn't yet come along, I thought, if I'm going to die anyway, I'd already bought the helium tank and balloons and stuff. There's a great way to painlessly kill yourself with helium. It's one of the most effective techniques. And there's a good book, The 5 Last Acts, on, how to prepare for a good death. I wasn't in an emergency. I was just aware that for 40 years, the amount of minutes where I'd had more well-being than anxiety and pain was probably 20, 80, something like that. There were, I would say, 5 to 10%, something like that, of my minutes on this planet had been really worth living. And I'd never been able to sustain them. There was a hedonic adaptation curve, basically, that a new rush, like discovering sexuality or, gourmet cooking or travel to Thailand or whatever it was that, I could get up into that new rush and I could sustain that for maybe a month or so, and then whether it was a month or a year, it would lose its newness. And the underlying anxiety, dread, pain, loneliness, frustration was just waiting there for that rush to wear off. And it was painful. And Lazaris didn't begin to touch that. And being told all you have to do is listen to this tape and this tape, which is the favorite pastime of every Lazaris friend, is to just recommend some of the hundreds of tapes so that they don't have to listen and feel and connect and actually get to know you. That's lonely and it's painful because Lazaris techniques are endless. And, having done a great number of them, all but the child and adolescent tapes just didn't go anywhere. Painful. So I decided to do a psychedelic session, this then gets into all the politics and stuff. And I thought, I can always kill myself after the psychedelic session if it doesn't work. And I had this man come over. He did a terrible job, and I almost died. I felt after feeling great on MDMA, I crashed, and for the next 2-3 days, I was in absolute horror and contractions. Well, I hadn't read about that in any of the books, and this guy was not the slightest bit interested. More sociopathic Americans wanting to check off their mental checklist rather than be there, for this horror. And and that's one of the more painful aspects of living in this culture. It's one of the reasons I am much happier in Thailand, but I don't have legal basis, I don't have a clear path to kind of move to Thailand. There's some definite anxiety and fear, and if you invest a few million baht and start a company in just this way, but there's a lot of stress and anxiety around that. So just painful, sad, bitter, frustrating, lonely. Because my outer world was pretty idyllic. And nobody gets really in this culture that you can be making lots of money, have lots of free time, have lots of sex, have lots of travel, achieve lots of goals, talk articulately, and be absolutely miserable at the same time. And we're a very impatient cult when it comes to actually understanding and empathizing rather than just giving out unsolicited surface advice without actually learning anything. And that's lonely. So I decided I asked a high facilitator, Peter Sandhill, who had tried to get me to do MDMA with him and pay him to do it together after expressing sexual interest in me as a heterosexual male. And it felt horrible at the time, but I was pretty desperate. So I asked Peter Sandhill if he would facilitate my first psilocybin, my first mushroom experience. He said, sure. Just went downhill from there. As it turned out, he hadn't told his wife. He broke his facilitator agreements. It's the last thing a therapist should be doing, is getting romantically involved with a patient. I didn't think it would come up, but it did. And so this led to a whole kind of catastrophe of kind of both new identity born in psychedelics and hope, because I got to see myself operating outside of the biology, outside of the PTSD, and really get in touch with a sense of self that was worth living for. But then, discovering that first your therapist, then their wife, who's also your therapist, then all of his peers who are the leaders of your community, all have an interest in secrecy, blame, shame, denial at the expense of the patient, and that they won't give the support that's pledged and ethical. And, I just plummeted into 5 times more pain than I knew how to deal with. And so I'm wrestling, like, am I going to die? Is there any, what am I going to do here? And at some point in that kind of spinning around, I learned about trauma and all that. I started to unload shame in this process. So, I was angry at everyone and everything. I was furious at the high facilitators for all their betrayals and, and abuses. I was furious at the high community for turning a blind eye. I wrote to them and said, please help me. No one wanted anything to do with, uncovering sexual abuse by their teachers and stuff. It was very shadow averse, very shaming, and complete abandonment. And I thought, the last thing I want to hear is how I'm creating this again by some fucked up person who won't even talk, and so I started an unloading process. Nobody wanted to listen, so I started making videos, talking to a camera like this, and saying things because I was so out of it that I couldn't have a meditation. I needed to talk to something outside of me, and as people folded like flies, ran like flies from anything real and substantive and deep, that got painful, just to hear the latest excuse of why absolutely everyone was not available to be a human being at a time of, great suffering. I started talking to cameras and to the public indirectly. And the goal being to be of service to other people in the world dealing with the same thing, because I grasped at a deep level that this was not about me, that this was our cultural shadow playing out in this dynamic, but that a lot of people were dealing with this who had less options than myself. And so that gave meaning to the amount of pain. Meaning, I knew I could put it into words better than most people, because that's the biggest, most common compliment that I get. Wow, that's what I knew, that's what I was thinking, but you've said it better than I could have said it, or anyone that I know could have said it. I get that kind of feedback. So I thought, let's put it to use. If I'm going to be on this earth in way more pain than well-being, let's at least use that talent to be of service, and be helpful. And, so anyway, I vent. So then we have the next phase of Lazaris, which was kind of dumping all the shadow, stuff, Lazaris, I'm sick of this, so making videos, talking about, all the layers of abuse with my parents, making videos talking about all the layers of abuse at the Human Awareness Institute, talking about the layers of abuse with my Waldorf hypocrite teachers and this, that, and the other, and just the family dynamics and all the hypocrisy of New Age. There was this endless stream of New Age ideas from my parents, but it always boiled down to the same thing, that it was their children's fault and that they were, wonderful beings of some kind. It was just so pathetic to watch as a child and teenager. All these New Age ideas twisted to avoid responsibility or anything like that. So there's a lot to let go, because in my teenage years working with Lazaris and self-pity and positive attitude, the whole idea was be positive, look at the bright side. So I hadn't unloaded a lot of this stuff, because I'd gone right into one of my first big books starting my business was Success with a Positive Mental Attitude. And it's a wonderful book. It helped me start my business and all that. But I had gone over so many feelings that had been numb with trauma for so long. And this culture rewards positivity to, a large extent. And so, that seemed, I just tried to do things that I'd never done before, because obviously I knew the things that I had done before didn't work, because they'd brought me here into more pain than I'd ever felt. By a huge margin. It literally floored me. I couldn't move laying on the floor for about a month. After I started getting attacked for bringing up the shadow side publicly, when the high facilitators would not provide any support. And I watched my pain just go up and up, and I asked, and I asked, and I asked. And then I just said, fuck them. We're not going to let these people damage the public. They're teachers, they're therapists, you fucking assholes. Do your job or get the fuck out of the business. So this is a somewhat new voice. That's not a new age spiritual voice, but this is, there. So I found a certain grit in hate, in rage, in revenge, which was a very new feelings, new sensation. I was very curious. I believe deeply in the goodness of human beings and in the evolutionary process towards more beauty, more fun, more love, that is an inexorable force driving life forward. And so I was fascinated to see what role hate and revenge and stuff had as, in the evolutionary process. I'd never found myself needing those energies to get out of bed. And I did find there is a continuum in the, in the emotional states, and hate will get you out of bed if there's just too much pain and exhaustion to get out for any other reason. So it's like, oh, thank you, hate, for I'm getting out of bed. That's a start, and how do we then move from there? I found that putting everything into words and refusing to keep secrets from all the people who were lying, shaming, abusing, this and that. No more secrets. I'm not going to keep that for you. I'm not going to carry it so that you feel more comfortable. That was a step to releasing some of the chronic fatigue and depression. So, there was a whole, and Lazaris was a big part of that, of course, because, there's so much stuff about Lazaris that, it isn't helpful, and this wasn't very good, and that's shitty, and why did you tell my teenage self this? And so I did a lot of unloading with that, and I got kind of quite worked up about that. I actually thought about suing Jach once, because I put all that in an email to Jach, and he said, I'm not going to open this because I don't have time for intimate friends. And I thought, you fucking bastard. You're such a hypocrite, Is this what you do when you fuck up, long-term clients, and so, but there was something going on that was very positive in terms of, I'm not going to be silenced. And so I had the kind of letter of court order kind of drawn up. And there was just something about being willing to take a stand for myself that was constructive and healing and medicinal, and released that hurt and that anger, a lot of it, around Lazaris. And ironically, as I was getting ready to send that letter to Concept Synergy officially, it will be sued for this and this and this, I just felt this big release. And I actually felt Lazaris in a real way that you can't feel when you're numb and in trauma and stuff, and carrying repressed rage and anger and all that. But I thought, fine, Lazaris, if you want to work it out this way with energy and this and that, that's fine. I'm going for healing. I'm going for integration. I'm going for truth. I'm not going to carry people's shit anymore. I don't care how it goes down. I'm just not carrying these contracts anymore. And so, so I felt great. And I found that I could then listen to Lazaris tapes. But then there would be this wave. I'd listen to the Lazaris tapes. I'd feel good, this and that and the other. Then another wave would come up. You Lazaris, you did this, and I hate this, and that's off, and this is off, and the community does this and this. And that had to be let out, And so there was this kind of dance of letting and venting stuff out, with videos, and then letting more in. And then Barbara Brannon contacted me about, all of her severe PTSD and trauma, watching Penny die, being fired, nearly being on the street, having her emails silenced, being treated like shit, as Jach's version of spiritual family, which was both validation, and I wanted to be supportive because I knew what it felt like to be isolated. So, and then, so I've been in this kind of going back and forth. And then I had an abuse dynamic with my landlord that blew up during COVID. He had slowly deteriorated into more and more abuse. And as a traumatized person, I didn't want to move. I was afraid of the unknown. And, so I had tolerated his abusiveness because I didn't want to face the unknown in all of this. And I'd actually told him, I'd said, I've developed severe trauma around this sexual abuse and stuff. And I just don't want to move now. Well, he took that as an advantage to start abusing, not doing his job, verbally abusing me in ways, raising the rent dramatically. I didn't mind the rent raise, but it's just another sad thing. I was like, I don't want to be in a fucked up world like this where you reveal that you're hurt and sociopaths attack you for revealing your vulnerability. What kind of fucked up world is this? The new age Lazaris was talking about? Well, so all of this kind of leads to, more of that. But I moved house to a much nicer house with wonderful neighbors and a wonderful landlord. And that was a big release and took a lot off. And I began enjoying the Lazaris tapes, or I just started the streaming thing. And then this last wave came up with, this user agreement, which I'd been sensitized to from all that Barbara Brannon had talked about, that basically Concept Synergy is leveraging their control of access to Lazaris to intimidate people into putting up with unhealthy dynamics and then not speaking up about it because they're controlling the relationship with Lazaris. And that kind of summed up the user agreement as far as I could tell, particularly as my service was cut off as soon as I wouldn't agree to it. And so that's then leading into this phase of, a little bit more, so on the one hand, I've let go of a lot of that pent-up charge from probably making 10 hours of venting all the little minutiae of annoyances, maybe 15 hours of, pains and experiencing with Lazaris friends, experiencing with Lazaris, all the questions, all the inconsistencies, and that are somewhat blocked if you really believe Lazaris is the highest resonance to ever touch the planet and, all these wonderful things. Well, then you're not supposed to be, mad at that, particularly when Lazaris says it's all about you creating your reality. He never talks about him creating the reality. But that's irritating as well. If you're with a wife or a husband who every time you have the problem in the relationship, they talk about why are you creating that, and it's all about you, and we have no part in it. That's kind of bullshit. And so this is kind of the wave of having vented and kind of said my piece about all of that. There's a little bit of humor. There's a little bit of, lightness. Lazaris is, off his pedestal. And there's gifts there, the morning tapes, the evening tapes and stuff. I enjoy the resonance. Who cares if Lazaris creates universes or creates puddles or just spends all his time channeling with Jach? Who cares? There's some good stuff, just like there is with everyone. But I do care about the people who are beginning this process, who don't know what's coming, who don't understand that there's nothing wrong with them, and that if they're traumatized, they're not going to learn about trauma and PTSD from Lazaris in any useful way, or concept synergy. And if things don't work for them, they'll probably be shamed and told to listen to endless tapes. And I don't want that, for the next generation of people who were like my teenage self, who probably would have greatly enjoyed meeting me. I would love to meet my teenage self. And I think my teenage self would have greatly enjoyed. I think we'd get on really well, as friends. And so I wanted to kind of explore these things. So there's multiple tracks. There's tracks of being in service. There's tracks of still, unloading bits that come up. There's the track of, calling out some of the bullshit coming out of concept synergy, and supporting people and setting a platform, that people like Barbara Brannon and stuff who have been severely, traumatized by, some of the abuse tactics at concept synergy, have validation, that they're not the only voices, because this culture loves, along with Lazaris, to say, oh, there's, focus on the positive, just don't be negative. No, there's a lot of bullshit, around all of this, and it should be dealt with, so that you can, in fact, enjoy the positive. Because I think there is, whatever it is, and however, there's something or some things incredibly positive that I'm very supportive of around aspects of Lazaris and the Lazaris material. And I'm sure aspects of concept synergy and Jach and all that. But I'm really fed up with the the narcissistic absorption and control. That it doesn't matter what clients are going through. It doesn't matter what employees are going through. It doesn't matter that employees are being thrown out on their ear in their older age without adequate retirement or salary or anything. It doesn't matter about that. We're all in our love and light about the material. No, that matters a lot, and it speaks. I'd say it's the biggest critique of the Lazaris material is, the horrendous deaths of Penny and Michael, the greed and incompetence of Jach Pursel, and the sociopathic behavior of the staff to one another at the behest of Penny and Jach Pursel, and the incredible hypocrisy of talking about endless abundance and grace and not even paying the staff a living wage. I think that speaks way louder than Lazaris's words. Just as human beings giving me real help and love more than, all of Lazaris's, and the year of grace and the year of this and all of that. I think, again, it's good to know. A decent human being capable of adult love can be 10 times more potent and meaningful than a monologuing channeled entity, regardless of claims. And I think this is, good space for that. So in this last phase, I'm both enjoying Lazaris more, cut off, of course, from the streaming service, by not agreeing to an abuse contract, and feeling relatively unloaded and unburdened, etc. From all these questions and thoughts, which if Concept Synergy doesn't want to answer them in private or address any of them in any adult way, fine. Well, in a free internet that Concept Synergy cannot control, some adults over time, we can have some degree of healthy dialogue. And that's great. And there's a release and relief also in, the freedom of film, because you don't have to repeat yourself endlessly. And I like that. This is both therapy for me, including this video, but it's also, I know my adolescent would love to study, videos like this, and he loves this kind of thing. And so perhaps, someone else's child of hypocritical parents dealing with Lazaris will, stumble across this and feel seen, a little bit less lonely. Well, I really like that. So that's kind of the, I'd say the third or fourth wave of my relationship with Lazaris, where I listen to very little of the talks now, and there's just some meditations that I find quite healing, and I focus on what does work: goals, plans, deepening my relationship with my wife, and seeing what life has to offer.